It is imperative that people continue to follow the rules designed to protect their families, their friends, and their loved ones.
The situation is fragile, and we are in a situation where caution and not exuberance is the essence.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Ignatius, Foreign Affairs columnist at the Washington Post. Thank you for tuning in to Washington Post Live. This interview is the first in a new series, Coronavirus Global Outlook, which will offer international perspectives on the fight against COVID-19 and feature world leaders, ambassadors, and health officials to capture the full impact of this global emergency. I'm very pleased this afternoon to begin this series with two of Europe's top diplomats in Washington. German Ambassador to Washington, Emily Haber, former State Secretary both in the Foreign Office and in their Homeland Security Department, and Britain's new ambassador to Washington, named Karen Pierce, former British permanent representative of the United Nations, both distinguished diplomats. Thank you both for taking the time to speak with me and with all of us. Let me just start with the bottom line, the grim numbers. These are two key allies of the United States, two distinct and very different experiences with COVID-19. As of this morning, UK total cases 161,000 with 21,678 deaths. Germany 157,641 cases and 6,115 deaths, far fewer. The US, by contrast, 1 million cases and 58,000 deaths. So we're hoping today that we can all learn from each other's experience as we think about where we've been and where we're going with this pandemic. Ambassador Pierce, let me begin by asking you. Britain has a very visible sign of how hard this pandemic has hit in the hospitalization, indeed for a time in the emergency room of your new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And I want to ask you whether, from what you sense, that experience changed how he looked at this problem. He, before the crisis became severe, talked about it's okay to continue shaking hands and had a somewhat low-key response, some people said. Has he been changed by the experience of being in the hospital and really in the face of this pandemic personally?
I think the big from the hospital has been the overwhelming concern for NHS workers, National Health Service workers, to get them equipment, but also to pay tribute to the amazing job they're doing on the front line. I think we'd already started to have a more significant lockdown before the Prime Minister went into hospital. And now he's come out, he's made it very clear that he wants to make sure we can avoid a second wave. That's very much on his mind. But he's also asked for work to be done on how we can get to a plan for reopening the economy. So I don't think there's a big change there, but he's said how grateful he is to the National Health Service workers who kept him safe.
Ambassador Pierce, as we try to think, all of us, about lessons learned from what we've been living through, do you think it's a fair criticism to say that the United Kingdom was initially slow in organizing its response to this pandemic, and that's one of the takeaways?
I think we wanted to follow the science right from the start, and then the science became clearer, and it was clear that in response to that, we had to adopt more stringent lockdown measures. So, as I say, we've tried to be led by the science, but it took us in a different direction than we had originally expected. We also have put more emphasis recently on testing. We're very admiring of what Germany has done on testing. I think that's been really critical. And so we have now upped all of our testing to try and get a grip of the virus.
So that's a good point of transition to ask Ambassador Emily Haber from Germany to share with all of us, share with our audience around the country, I hope around the world, why Germany has been more successful than many countries in containing this virus. The death count, as I noted at the outset, is far lower than many countries that are near you, similar to you. Why is that? What did Germany do right that the rest of the world can learn from?
I noticed that many people here tend to paint the German case in different colors than cases across other European countries, which is not entirely true. We have, as you pointed out, very nearly 160,000 people who were infected, and the illness came pretty early on. And we've put in place all the measures that the UK has put in place, or other European countries, or EU for that matter, including testing, contact tracing, hygiene rules, and so forth, lockdown, social distancing. But two aspects stand out. One is we had a head start because even before the WHO had determined that this was that human-to-human transmission was possible, the German scientists had developed a test for precisely this crisis, which then, when it was determined as pandemic, was quickly mass-produced, recognized by the WHO. We did rigorous testing early on, and we did rigorous contact tracing early on, which allowed us to prepare ourselves, to prepare the hospital system. We nearly doubled the intensive care units, beds, and the respiratory equipment in the months between January and March. So all of that prepared us for the rise of the numbers of those infected, and at no stage our healthcare system was overwhelmed because we had been able to prepare. Also, we had a pandemic strategy in place, which made us prepared to take exactly the steps that were necessary. At no stage did we have to discuss whether people would have to pay for testing, because the procedures had been determined, and we acted according to the procedures that had been fixed. So I would say early testing, a well-cared healthcare system, well-oiled healthcare system, preparation in the intensive care units, and early hospitalization, which made sure that those who were infected wouldn't enter the second stage of the illness with severe symptoms. That was part of our strategy.
Ambassador Haber, Germany, like the United States, has a federal system. Many of our viewers may not realize that, but you have your Länder, your different, more local organizations. But you seem to have done a better job of coordinating those federal decentralized units with central planning than we've been able to do. And I wonder how you've been so successful at that. Is there a simple formula you could offer about how you're able to coordinate these decentralized operating units with a central plan?
Well, first of all, decentralization was really a competitive edge, because decisions could be taken locally and not without referring to any federal level. So that was important. Also, we have structures in place that facilitated, because it always happened, it facilitates regular contacts, regular discussions, regular conferences between all health ministers and the federal health level. The same is true for the meetings and conferences of the Chancellor with the Prime Ministers of the federal states. So we had an intricate structure of referring to one another and coordinating in place. We didn't have to set it up.
So one more question before I turn back to Ambassador Pierce, and that's about your leadership. We talked a moment ago about Boris Johnson's personal experience. I think the whole world was moved by his hospitalization, a very clear risk that he was facing. We note the joyous news today of the birth of a son ahead. So I want to ask you, Ambassador Haber, about your leader, your Chancellor Angela Merkel. It's often said that part of Germany's success is that it had someone who, in a way, was uniquely appropriate to deal with this kind of crisis. I read that she was herself a scientist. She was also the daughter of a Lutheran pastor, so she combined the scientific knowledge and a sense of compassion, which was the right mix. Maybe you could just say a few words about your chancellor and how you think she's responded to this crisis and why she seems to have gotten it pretty right.
Well, the polls tell us that she personally, but the entirety of the government as well, has enjoyed great support for the course taken. And I would add that perhaps German citizens wouldn't have followed the guidelines issued by federal states and by the federal level had they not credited her, the government, and the federal governments of the federal states with credibility for the pretty tough course that we have chosen.
Ambassador Pierce, I want to turn now to the question that we're all beginning really to think hard about, and that's how we return from this period of economic lockdown. Basically, our economies in the U.S., U.K., and Germany have all been essentially shuttered, and we're going to move now towards something more active. And I'd be grateful if you would lay out for us what the thinking is in Britain with your Prime Minister and his key advisors about this path toward reopening the British economy. And then I'll turn to Ambassador Haber and ask her about Germany.
Well, thank you. Very much on everyone's mind, as I say, and the Prime Minister returned to work asking for plans to be drawn up for a roadmap for this. I think it has several key ingredients. One is phased. How do you phase the reopening of an economy? When do you reopen schools? What sort of businesses do you reopen? There may be something very important about getting outdoors industries going back first, construction, gardening, that sort of thing. There's something very important about help to businesses. We've been given a lot of loan guarantees to businesses, some 15% of our GDP. So that's an important element. We want to study global supply chains. Throughout this crisis, both Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab have been clear we want to keep the global economy moving. We want to keep trade flowing. At the same time, we need to have a proper look at what countries need to produce themselves to make them more resilient. And from our perspective, we're also very keen that we use our overseas aid to help developing countries get more resilient in health. And we think that's a very important part. And there's some interesting work going on vaccines that we might come on to. But I think those are the key ingredients for us. And there's something very important about the messaging around this. How to get people back to work safely. You had a shot earlier of our banner when we give news conferences: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. We now need to find the right sort of message so that people can get back to work safely.
And Ambassador Pierce, as your government begins to think about what the fall is going to look like, a question every American family, I'm sure every family in Britain and Germany too, is wondering is, will my kids be going back to school? How's that going to work? And I'd be curious, as you read the statements from your colleagues, what that question of getting both elementary, primary, high school students and university students back on their campuses in September. Does that seem possible to you?
It's certainly something we're looking at. We have a different school term from in America. We have 3 school terms a year, so we actually have a summer term which normally doesn't finish until late July. University terms finish May or June. So I think it is hard to see the universities being able to get lots of people back this summer. I think there's a slightly different question about schools, whether primary school or high school, that will be looked at. I don't want to make a commitment that I might not be able to keep, but certainly we would like to have the education system at all three levels up and running again in September.
That's fascinating. I had not heard that sharp statement. Ambassador Haber, let me ask you similarly about reopening in all its dimensions, and I'll start with German industry. Volkswagen, we read, was back at work on Monday, resuming production of vehicles, but under very different rules. And I wonder if you could explain to us what the view is of the Chancellor, her government, and Germany's business leaders about the path back in manufacturing, distribution, all the other elements of commerce. Then we'll turn in a minute to the question of getting people back to school. But what about Volkswagen and the other businesses?
The thinking in Germany is that we'll start very incrementally. The situation is still very fragile. We have a reproduction rate of the illness now at 0.9%, but it was slightly higher the days before and lower the days before that. So it's not stable as yet. And that's where we don't have a straight highway leading us to a complete reopening of the society. We'll decide as we move along, assessing the situation, assessing the effects of every single opening for the rest of the society, and constantly weighing the health security risks for the society against the economic risks. So now, in the first incremental steps, we have reopened a number of companies and a number of retail stores and a number of schools under very new rules, that is health rules, hygiene rules, etc. But what is certain for us is we'll work incrementally, and we decide and reassess as we move along. Now, just on the second point that my British colleague has made, what we do nationally doesn't happen in a completely separate universe. Everyone knows that this flu may come back. There may be different waves. So whatever we do within our national borders will possibly be affected, and we in turn can affect others by the degree of effectiveness in other countries, not only Europeans, but across the world. And this makes it very, very urgent that we take responsibility to help other countries and to make them more resilient, to equip them, to give humanitarian aid. Because much as everyone says we're in the same boat, yes, we are, and we can't afford to be as inward-looking and just fending for ourselves as, and I say that with some criticism too, as we've been, my country certainly has been in the very early stages of the crisis.
That's well said, something we all need to think about more. Let me just ask you to focus on the question of students getting back to school. If I heard you right, you said that in some limited cases already this week, some schools are reopening. Tell us a little bit more about that, and then what you think Germany will look like as we end the summer and get into the normal beginning of the academic year.
The understanding as of today is that schools will reopen, but not for all classes and not at the same time. You can say that between now and the beginning of summer, every German student will have gone to his classes at some stage, but it will be a very differentiated pattern.
Let me turn now to the question of resumption of trade and possible new trade agreements, and ask Ambassador Pierce to lead us off on that. Dominic Raab, your foreign secretary, said today that he would like to see a rapid UK-EU trade deal by the end of this year. It was a comment he made, I think, this morning in London. Is that realistic under current circumstances? And what would you want to see in that UK-EU trade deal accomplished so quickly, as he said, as a stabilization mechanism?
Well, we would like to try and conclude the EU-UK trade deal agreement, free trade deal, this year, as the Foreign Secretary said. It's a difficult timetable, but we believe it's possible. The situation at the moment is that we have several rounds with the European Union. One round has just concluded. Both sides are negotiators called David Frost. The European Union negotiator is Michel Barnier. Both are very skilled at their jobs. The next rounds will take place, and then there'll be a stock taking in June where they make a bigger assessment of progress made. But certainly we are looking for good market access. We're looking for fair trade, fair deals. From our perspective, we obviously want to have at least as good access as countries outside the European Union. Now, the last round was in a little bit of doubt about that last point, but we hope it will be possible to move forward and be able to have a good, solid free trade deal by the end of the year.
And Ambassador Pierce, you told Politico recently, not long after your arrival in the United States, that you'd like to see the U.S. and the U.K. get started in negotiation for a trade deal between our two countries. How's that going? Have you had any conversations yet with U.S. trade officials? Do you get any signal that they might be ready to begin that process soon? And what will you be looking for in that negotiation?
I think it's COVID-19 is the reason why we haven't actually formally launched those negotiations. But there's a lot of will on both sides and a lot of preparations going on both sides. And so certainly we believe that's something that's achievable, but there are a couple more things to tie down before we actually have a formal launch. I think one of the important things about both trade deals, if you like, is that they would be an expression of confidence in the global economy's recovery after COVID-19. So I think there are big reasons, as well as trade reasons, to press ahead in the best way we can. And if I can talk more generally about economy and economic recovery, I think we also see it as a very good opportunity to try and bring back economic recovery and help other countries, particularly developing countries, get to grips with it in a more green and sustainable way than might otherwise have been the case. So we do see an opportunity there. I don't want to gloss over the difficulties. We've been talking about some of them, but I think there's a bit of an opportunity here. And if we can get it right, then we give the world economy a really good boost of confidence.
So let me turn now to the question I think we all think most about when we think about the path back from this crisis. Path back to good health and economic stability. I think of the 3 T's: tracing, testing, and therapies, new drug therapies. So, Ambassador Haber, on those 3 T's, Germany's been a leader in testing and tracing, but I noted an interesting pullback by your government from having a centralized app that people would use in the tracing process, and Germans who always worry about privacy issues seem to have felt that was a step too far. So just tell us briefly where you see Germany on my three T's list.
On testing and tracing, you already made the relevant points. It's true, we pulled back from a federal solution in developing a tracing app. But this does not mean that we dropped the tracing app. We're working on it just this very minute, but it was fed after a very emotional public debate on the privacy issues that an app will only work if people accept it, and if people accept the urgency and the necessity and will actually participate. And that was the reason to reconsider the federal solution, the central solution, and revisit the earlier option of having a decentralized solution. In addition to the technological option, we have also set up healthcare tracing teams in every single healthcare authority in the German federal states, which on a personnel level, if you like, are doing the tracing too, because we feel tracing is important for getting to grips with the pandemic.
Ambassador Pierce, we noted with interest, everybody studies vaccine development now in a way that we never did before. We have a deep personal interest in it. And so we noted that an Oxford team, according to American reporting, is moving quite fast toward developing a vaccine. Tell us a little bit about what you know about progress towards therapies by Oxford, other universities in Britain, and how that looks to your government as you think about the future. How soon are we, the basic question we all wonder, how soon are we going to have therapeutic drugs, whether vaccines or others, that might significantly change how this feels for all of us?
Well, as you say, Oxford University is pressing ahead. Trials have been promising. I think it's very difficult to put a date on it, unfortunately. And also, I think if we put a date on it and don't meet it, then we have a lot of people who then are worried when they have no need to be. But we will continue pressing ahead. There are also some companies here in America with both British and American connections who are looking at vaccines. And the WHO has a very big vaccine trial going on that takes in about 70 countries and 200 people taking part in that. So I think there's a very good global effort to try and find this vaccine. And then, of course, there'll be something about producing it. Do get a successful one. I know there are some people who think it's several months away, possibly longer. But I think the most important thing is that the companies, the universities, are really trying to build on the science and really trying to move things forward. I referred earlier to a vaccine summit that Germany and the UK and others were at last week. This is all about access to vaccines for countries around the world, and it's about trying to ensure that if a vaccine is developed, when it's developed, countries can have access to that vaccine on an equal basis. The British government's put in over $80 million to try and help that along. And I think that's a very important part of the vaccine discussion.
Mm-hmm. So, ambassadors, we're getting near the end of our half hour. I have one more question that I want to ask each of you, which is a little bit more sensitive one, but it's one that I've been thinking about, and I think many people have. Do your governments think it would be appropriate, as we try to understand this pandemic that has affected the world so powerfully, that China open an credible, internationally supported investigation into the origins of this COVID-19 virus in Wuhan, we believe, late last year? President Trump has called for such an investigation. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has similarly called for that. What do your governments think? Ambassador Pierce, you start off. What's the British government view about whether there should be a open Chinese investigation that's transparent?
I think there certainly needs to be some sort of review / investigation into how the virus got started, the wet markets in China, which do carry public health risks. This is at least the third virus, I think, to come out of China before the century is a quarter old. And that's quite a significant risk. So there needs to be definitely some measures taken around that, whether they're done by China or with international cooperation. I think we need to discuss. I think we probably also need to discuss the response of the World Health Organization. We need to learn after all these crises, just as we did after Ebola in 2014, we need to learn how we can always do things better. And I think it's certainly the British government's position that we do need some reforms in WHO and looking at the international health regulations. Whether you put all those together or do them separately, I think for discussion among experts, but we would like to see those areas addressed. However, and I think it's an important however, at the moment, the most important thing is to cooperate on tackling the pandemic and get on top of the virus. So we would see these sorts of reviews and reforms and investigations as something to come later, and put the focus at the moment on international cooperation to make sure we really can overcome the problems we've got at the moment.
Thank you. Ambassador Haber, we're at the end of our half hour. Any quick thoughts about the German view of whether this investigation, what happened in China, is appropriate?
We have to have a dispassionate look into why the pandemic occurred, how it occurred, what mistakes have been made, where a lack of transparency may have contributed to the rush of contagion. But it needs to create transparency and knowledge in order to equip us better for a future similar challenge. That also relates to the way we manage or handle the WHO issue. The WHO in this global health crisis plays a crucial role. It may have made mistakes. We'll have to look at what worked, what didn't work, and why, but it can't happen in the midst of the crisis. Politicization in both issues would probably be mutually exclusive with getting the transparency we absolutely need.
So we're out of time. I want to, on behalf of all the people who've been watching, thank both of you, ambassadors, for speaking so clearly and directly to the issues we're all thinking about. Before I sign off, a reminder that Washington Post national political reporter Bob Costa will interview Maryland Governor Larry Hogan tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on your streaming channel. And on Friday, I will be interviewing the CEO of Ford Motor Company, Jim Hackett. We'll talk about the impact of the virus on the auto industry and Ford's coronavirus response. You can head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and learn more. Thank everyone, especially the British and German ambassadors, for joining us this afternoon. And be safe, be well. We'll see you virtually online again.
Thank you. Thank you.